Justin Franson here with the legend GaryVitti. He is one of the most respected athletic trainers in the history of NBA and I think any sport in general. Being with the Lakers for my entire youth, I grew up in LA as a Laker fan, and all we would hear about was Gary Vitti, and he was probably a bigger name than some of the players on the team, many would say. So, Gary, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Appreciate meeting with you. It's so great because we have so much similarities, and then a lot of the technology we're working on is so different. So it's so fun to chat with him. But today, what I want to chat with him about is more about your history with the Lakers, and people want to hear about how you were able to be such a pivotal pillar for the Lakers for so long.
Yeah. Well, let's go back a step because the first few words out of your mouth, I heard the word legend. Okay? And I'm often referred that way. It makes me uncomfortable. I don't see myself as a legend. But the truth is that I did work with a lot of legends. It doesn't make me one, but it makes me a very fortunate person to have been around some of the great champions in sports history. Now, to go to your question, were you asking me how did I get there or how did I stay there as long as I did?
Well,
or both?
Yeah, tell us more about when you're there. Mm-hmm. What were your philosophies on having such success?
Yeah. Well, my philosophy was fairly simple. Whatever I did in terms of training or therapy, I would always ask myself, what are you trying to do? Why are you doing it? And how are you going to do it? And if I did that, then everything sort of made sense to me, and I could make it make sense to the athlete. Especially today's athlete is a very smart athlete. You don't say, hey, we're going to run up to the top of Staples Center and jump off. Maybe in the old days, they would do whatever you told them to do. Now they want to know why. Right? They're very educated. It's the information highway, access to computers. They're smart. They know what you're talking about. And that's actually good for a guy like me because I do like to explain to them, this is what we're doing, this is why we're doing it, and this is how we're going to do it. And then, once I figured that out, my philosophy was always, evaluation first. So there's so many coaches out there that just can't wait to get on the court or get on the field and start training, doing performance training. And I was never that way. Before we get on the court, we have to evaluate you because what we've realized over time is that repetitive motion causes a compensation, and the compensation causes a dysfunction. So what that means is if you're swinging a golf club a bunch of times, or a tennis racket, or swimming, or shooting a basketball, or swinging a baseball bat, if you're doing the same thing over and over again, you're going to create a compensation which will lead to a dysfunction. And that, what I just described, is what we would call macro motion. But that's the same thing with micro motion. If you're sitting in front of your computer all day, you're going to develop a compensation. Your shoulders are going to get rounded, your head's going to come forward, and that's bad posture. So what we're looking at is the athlete's posture and how is it related to their movement efficiency. So in the old days, we looked at what we call static posture. You just have the athlete stand there and you look at it. Okay? We evolved, kind of all started back in the 80s with a Czechoslovakian doctor by the name of Vladimir Janda. And he put together like 3 postural distortion patterns that he called upper cross syndrome, lower cross syndrome, and pronation distortion syndrome. That evaluation evolved to Gray Cook in the 90s, who came up with these 7 functional movement patterns. And if you could do the movement perfectly, you got 3 points. So you had a total possibility of 21 points to be evaluated. All longitudinal studies in the NFL said that if your score was 14 points or below, you're going to get hurt. You had a really high risk. And he then developed another functional movement assessment program for people who couldn't do the first 7 movements. He then made them do something else. That then evolved to Michael Clark for the National Academy of Sports Medicine. He created the Fusionetics platform. But all of these functional assessments were all subjective in nature, meaning you looked at the athlete and you decided what was wrong with them. We've now evolved to high-speed cameras and high-speed wireless sensors. And so now we can take the subjectiveness out of it, and it's totally an objective evaluation. So we'll put some sensors on you, we'll put you in front of a camera, we'll have you do some functional movement patterns, very similar to Gray Cook and Michael Clark's evaluations. And we can not only know how that you went into valgus, meaning your knee dropped in, you couldn't control the stability in the mid part of your body as you're moving, because that's the important thing. You're not just standing there statically, but we want to look at you as you're moving through space, you know, because that's how you are in sports. You're moving through space. Can you control your center of gravity as you're moving through space in an uncontrolled manner, as happens in sports? And these high-speed cameras and wireless sensors now can tell us not only that you went into valgus or varus or pronation, but exactly how many degrees. And generally it's about a 5-degree range either way. So if you're more than 5 degrees in valgus, then we take you out of a green zone. So what we did is we created a stoplight, green, yellow, red. If you're within 5 degrees of valgus or varus, I'm just using this one example, there's other things, you know, sensors that we can put on your back, your cervical area, your lumbar area. And so we can evaluate your whole posture throughout your entire body. But to make things simple, let's just talk about knee, valgus, and varus, because that's really where guys get hurt. Eccentric load, okay, trying to slow down, and torque. Those are the 2 things that the body doesn't like, and we can go back to this in a second. So we can put these sensors on you. If you're within 5 degrees of valgus or varus, then we're going to push you. You're in a green zone. We can push your training. We can push you in competition. But if you start dropping into the yellow zone, now we want to know why. Maybe it's because you're guarding Stephon Curry, okay? Or maybe it's because you're sick, or you didn't sleep well, or you're injured. We don't know, but that's when we start asking questions, and then we go to an RPE scale. And if you're in the red zone, then you're probably not in the game anymore because your performance is so bad, coach is taking you out, and your risk of injury is now really, really high. And so now we probably have to shut you down, reevaluate you, correct your posture, and before we can let you back out onto the court. So going back to the slowing down and the turning, what we really see as the risk of injury is what we call eccentric load. So if you could circumnavigate the globe, if you could have a track that went all the way around the earth, and you ran as fast as you could all the way around this track and never tried to slow down and never tried to turn, you would never get hurt, because we don't get hurt on acceleration. We get hurt decelerating. So when you see Michael Jordan flying down the court and he hits the free throw line and he leaves his feet and he goes, you know, I believe I can fly, the whole song, he's flying through the air and he dunks the ball. It looks like it's a total acceleration, including the takeoff. You can't see it with your human eye, but right before he took off, he slowed down. And to slow down, that's what we call an eccentric load. That's when muscles lengthen as opposed to shortening. So the way I explain this to people that don't understand eccentric load If you took a dumbbell and did a curl, that would be a concentric contraction, meaning a shortening of the bicep to bring this lever arm up. Now I want to lower that weight. If I lower it against gravity, that's lengthening this muscle eccentrically.
Right.
And that's where injuries occur. Now, the other thing the body doesn't like is torque, is twisting. So probably the guy that I've seen in my career that was the best at this is Russell Westbrook, where he could run straight at you full speed, stop on a dime right in front of you, and either go straight up, meaning he doesn't run over you, okay, or he stops on a dime and pivots left or pivots right. That moment that he stops and pivots, he's at a very, very high risk of injury. And he's the best at it, and even he's gotten hurt numerous times and has had surgeries. So these are the things that we look for and that we evaluate for, and then that's what we train for, is to get someone in a proper functional posture. When they fatigue, they will go back into their default pattern.
Oh yeah, definitely.
Okay? And if you continue to train them after they fatigue, you're actually training them in a faulty posture, which means it makes it that much harder for us to get them out of that posture, and it leaves them at a higher risk of injury and a lower rate of performance. So the idea today is not to break through the wall, but get you up to the wall and then continue to train between here and here, okay, so that you have a stable core and you can control your body as you're moving through space in an uncontrolled manner for a longer period of time. So we're not breaking through the wall, we're actually moving the wall. So when you get to that breaking point, that's when we stop, and then we go into our recovery phase to get ready for the next training session. I think that makes sense.
Definitely. Awesome. Now, excuse me, knowing the stories of Shaq and Kobe, let's go there for a minute. I can't not, because everyone that I would hear would be like, Kobe doesn't stretch, and then Shaq wants to be a bodybuilder. So, you know, how do you balance the two, and what did they really rev at, and how did you balance that, you know, found philosophy with them?
Actually, neither of those things are true. Kobe stretched a lot.
Awesome.
Kobe paid a lot of attention to his body. He had numerous gurus, if you will, through his career. One of the reasons why is he was somewhat, at a younger age, sort of maniacal in his training. And so he would want to get up at 4 o'clock in the morning and go and train. Mm-hmm. Well, it's kind of hard to find somebody that is a good trainer, athletic trainer, or physical therapist that's going to get up at 4 o'clock in the morning at your whim. Okay? And so, you know, it would work for a while, then he'd wear those people out and then go to the next person, next person, next person. And he had some very good people. And he had some not so good people. Okay? And some of the, you know, the amount of basketball that he played at a young age, and some of the not so good training that he did at a young age put him in some postural distortion patterns that weren't good and affected his movement efficiency. But as he got older, the people around him were better and did a lot of correction, and a lot of that had to do with stretching. And a lot of it had you know, my philosophy is resistance stretching. You know, eccentrically loading and then trying to lengthen at the same time. So it's sort of a contract, relax situation. Shaq, you know, it was hard to get him into the weight room. And for one thing, I mean, in terms of strength, he certainly didn't need it. He was the strongest human being I've ever been around. I mean, I would go to the scores table once in a while to check on fouls or timeouts or something, and somebody, the center for the other team, was checking in the game. and they would lean over to me and whisper, "GV, how much does he weigh really? Because he's got to be 400 pounds. I can't move that guy. He's so big and strong." You know, Shaq was, I think, 358, 7 feet tall, 358 his last year with the Lakers. And he was a monster. So for him, it wasn't, as you said, bodybuilding. His situation was we were trying to balance his weight, make him symmetrical, make the right side of his body look like the left side of his body. He had a rectus tear, an abdominal tear. That did not require surgery. That's when we brought in Alex McKechnie, who's absolutely hands down the best physical therapist that I've ever been around. And I had a really hard time. Now, I've had other athletes that had abdominal tears that we brought back, but we had a really hard time bringing Shaq back. Mm-hmm. And one of those reasons is he was just so massive. You know, so what do you do with a guy that big? I mean, there's actually no model for it. He's the first, you know.
Definitely.
And so those abdominal tears we really see in soccer and hockey more so than basketball. We see them in basketball, but more so in the other sports. So McKechnie was from Scotland, but he settled in Vancouver, British Columbia, and he was working for the Vancouver Canucks, and I think the Sounders are up there, the soccer team. And so Ross Davidson was the team physician for both those teams and the Memphis Grizzlies. So when we were up there playing the Grizzlies, I paid McKechnie a visit. And, you know, he was all about the pelvis, because that was his wheelhouse, and pelvic position and pelvic tilt and, you know, pelvic floor exercises and things like that. And so we brought Shaq over there, and it became very obvious to me that after talking to Alex, that we heard what we thought we needed to do, but we didn't want to hear it, and that was we had to shut Shaq down and basically retrain his body. And that's what we had to do. So we put him on McKechnie's program. I was able to hire him as a consultant for about 40 days a year. And so we would pick when and where. So sometimes it made more sense for him to meet us on the road, and sometimes it made more sense to bring him in at homestand. And then after a few years of this, I was actually able to lure him away and hire him full-time with the Lakers. And I learned probably more about, for sure, the pelvis than anyone else in physical therapy and athletic training with McKechnie. So that was Shaq's thing. It wasn't a bodybuilding thing. It was sort of a core issue, because that's a lot of force. You know, you're 7 feet tall, 358 pounds, and Shaq could move like a cat. You know,
oh yeah,
he was
so dynamic.
The agility that he had. You know, if he wanted to be the best, he could have been.
Yeah. So I know we're limited on time with this talk, so just to give you a snippet, but before I get into Gary's book that he has coming out, I wanted to ask you just to give some advice for any up-and-coming industry expert athletic trainer. What would you advise them to do and look at?
Yeah, so most of what I tell the young people is, you know, we've had athletic trainers around since the gladiators, okay? But the area of sports medicine as a discipline at the most is probably 50 years old. And probably the evidence-based stuff is more around 40 years old. And probably the last 10 to 15 years is really where the sports science is really taking effect. And a lot of it has to do with the technology, that we can actually measure things now. We can get a baseline, and then we can keep coming back and evaluating and reevaluating. And so my advice is stay current. Okay? Stay current. Go to seminars. Read the journals, see where the science is. You know, look at double-blind studies in peer-reviewed journals, empirical evidence. because for one thing, we go back to what I said earlier about what am I trying to do, why am I doing it, how am I doing it? Well, if you have an evidence-based practice, then you can answer those questions and you can present it to the athlete. If you're working with a team, whether it's high school or college or the pros, and you have to defend what you're doing, you have a defense, something that you can,
Exactly.
go back and
Quantify it.
Exactly, you can quantify it, and you can say, listen, this is why I'm doing this.
Mm-hmm.
These are what the experts are saying to do, and this is how we do it, and this is why we do it. And so that's my advice, because even in the book, the last chapter of the book is the evolution of sports science, and I go back to 3600 BC, where Chinese emperors were forcing their subjects to exercise because they became more productive. And I start there and I bring it all the way to date with high-speed wireless sensors and high-speed cameras and where we are today. But the technology is moving very quickly. And as I mentioned to you before, that the sensors are actually more sensitive than we need them to be. So if that's the case, then why this sensor versus that sensor, this company's technology versus that company's technology? And the answer to that is that the science is in the algorithm, not the sensor. So we pick up more information than what we need, and who's out there that can mine out or weed out the information that's not pertinent to what we're trying to find out. When I was in graduate school, almost everything, all the predictive stuff, because that's what we're talking about, right? We're talking about an evaluation that would allow us to predict performance and risk of injury. And most of that was based on multiple regression equations. So if I asked you to predict something, but I didn't give you any information, basically you're guessing.
Right.
But if I give you one piece of information, now you have something to rely on that you can more accurately predict something. If I give you two pieces of information, now even more accurately. If I give you three, and so on, until you reach a point where no matter how much information you put into the equation, you cannot more accurately predict whatever it is you're trying to predict. And that's what we call the point of diminishing returns. Now, regression is not really what they're looking at. It's more about cluster analysis. So they're looking for clusters of information that correlate with something else. And these people are really, really bright. I did a keynote at the U.S. Military Academy at West Point. And the people that I did it to were the mathematics department. And they were trying to predict injury rates of the recruits at Fort Jackson. And when we got done looking at what they do to the recruits, how do they recruit them, what do they look like when they come to their camp, right? And then, what do you do the first day, the second day, the third day? They were able to build an algorithm that reduced the injury rate by 74%. That's a gigantic number. And it's monetized, right? Because if you bring a recruit in and he gets injured and, you got to kick him out of the Army, that costs the government money, right? And so they saved a couple $1 million of taxpayer money. So there's really bright people out there, and there's evidence-based practices that are published. There's websites, there's apps, there's everything. So do the technology, get on board with the cutting-edge stuff, and as it changes, change with the times, because you will get left behind. And if you become obsolete, it's exactly what you'll be, is obsolete.
No, I mean, this testing that he's talking about is brilliant. To be able to quantify a risk factor for someone getting injury it's unbelievable. So really impressive stuff. What would you recommend for an aspiring professional athlete?
Well, get with a good athletic trainer, a good physical therapist, or somebody that can really give you a good evaluation of your movement efficiency. And there's several platforms and apps and computer programs that are not very expensive, and then they can find out, you know, basically what's wrong with you, and then you can correct it. Okay? That would be on the physical side. Now there's also a whole emotional side of sports, a psychological side. And so we can quantify load in many ways, and we call that external load. Then we have something we call the internal load, and that's a psychological reaction to the external load and all the other things in your life, whether it's sleep, you know, recovery, did you get in a fight with your girlfriend, you know, does your mother have cancer, all the other things that affect you. And there's ways to quantify that as well with RPE scales and these types of evaluations that you can also plug into an equation. And you know, there's some research out there to what we call acute chronic workload ratio. And rather than get into the whole thing, people can buy the book and you can read it. But basically, acute workload would be your workload over 7 days, and the chronic workload is your workload over 28 days. And if your acute workload is greater than your chronic workload, then your performance is going to go down, and your risk of injury is going to go up. Now, one other thing in terms of the athlete, and I also describe this in the chapter in the book, is sort of a leadership type thing. And when we would get an athlete that we thought had some leadership capabilities, when it was the right time, because you got to figure out what makes an athlete tick, and that's when you go at him. You just don't go right in his face. You don't treat all athletes the same. Some need a pat on the back, some need a kick in the butt. It's different. So you got to figure out who you're dealing with, what makes them tick, and then you go and press those buttons. But you have to develop, in order to do that, you have to develop a trust with the athlete. And so I talk about this in the book, that I would ask the athlete to picture a window frame. And that window frame has 4 panes of glass. And in one pane of glass, I want you to put how you see yourself. In the second pane of glass, I want you to put how you think other people see you. In the third pane of glass, I want you to put how other people really see you. And in the fourth pane of glass, I want you to put how you really are. Now think about the permutations of those 4 variables. It's endless. I mean, but it also could be 1. All 4 panes could be the same. That's really what we want. And if that's true, then that means that you are very honest and true to yourself. And if you want people to follow you, they must feel like they know the true you, and for them to know the true you, you need to know your true self. So if you're true to yourself, people will follow you. Right? And I think that that's very important for an athlete to, if you're not in an individual sport and you're working with a team, then your teammates have to know the true you. Okay, to trust you that you're going to do the right thing, which may be sacrificing a piece of yourself for the good of the whole. And that's, you know, it's interesting. I had 13 coaches. We went to the finals 12 times in my 32 years. I had 13 coaches and 8 rings. And of the 13 coaches, all 8 rings are with 2 of those coaches. And that's what those 2 guys, who are diametrically opposite in personality, the 2 coaches, but what they were both good at was getting guys with giant egos and their own agendas, alpha males, and get them to sacrifice a piece of themselves for the good of the whole. And somehow they got them to buy into the fact that the strength was with the pack.
Awesome.
That's my advice.
Love it, love it. Now, you've scratched on your book a little bit. Dive a little deeper. When's it coming out? What's it about?
It's out.
It's out.
It's out, yeah.
Done.
It's out. The title of the book is 32 Years of Titles and Tears from the Best Seat in the House. And then the subtitle to that is what I learned about happiness, greatness, and leadership. And so the book really is not about me. It's about the life's lessons that I learned from the great champions that I worked with. So each chapter has basically a lesson that's attached to it. There is one chapter about me because the book people told me you have to write one chapter about yourself to tell people who you are so that when they read the stories, they know who's telling the story. And so there is a chapter about me, about where I grew up, how I grew up, that sort of thing. But for instance, the first chapter is called The Mission. And when I joined the Lakers in 1984, there was one mission and one mission only, and that was to beat the Boston Celtics. It wasn't to win an NBA championship. It was to beat the Boston Celtics to win the NBA championship.
Right.
It was that specific. And, Coach Riley, I talk about, like today we have a GPS. For a GPS to work, you must know two things: where you are and where you want to go. If you only know one thing, the GPS is basically useless. So Coach Riley was our GPS. He knew where we were and he knew where we wanted to go. If you have those two things, you can plan a path to get there. And he was our GPS, and so he taught us that, and I talk about this in the book, that for a mission to be successful, we have to plan a path. We all have to be on the same page. I learned early on that I was paid to render an opinion. If my superior said, okay, thank you for your opinion, we're not going to do it that way, we're going to do it this way, then it became my job to prove basically that I was wrong and you were right. Because I can't be behind your back saying, yeah, we shouldn't do it that way, I told them we should do it this way. I have to get on board. We all have to be going in the same direction. We need short-term goals, medium-term goals, and long-term goals, and we have to check those and go back to them and write them down, and basically that's the mission in chapter 1, which ended up with us beating the Boston Celtics, because the Lakers played the Celtics 8 times up to 1984, and it was the 9th time that not because of me, but coincidentally, I showed up in 1980-45 season. That's the year that we finally let all the skeletons out of the closet. We shoved the leprechaun in the closet, and then we were able to finally get past the curse of the leprechaun. And so it's things like that along the way that my daughters, I would learn these lessons, come home and teach them to my daughters, and then my daughters call them GV gems. And so that's what it is. It's a bunch of GV gems.
Love it.
One of the chapters, and one of the things I learned is that you have to laugh a little each day. And so there's some chapters in there that many people have reached out to me that have read the book now and have said that the book made them laugh and made them cry. And that's what it was. It was Titles and Tears.
Love it. Where can we pick it up?
Amazon. Just get on Amazon, put my name in the search box, and it'll pop right up. And if you like it, give me a good review. If you don't, keep it to yourself.
Oh man, well, I look forward to the read. So you guys, GaryVitti, this is awesome. Thank you so much for sharing your insight and going beyond with us and talking to us about the history that you've had and as a facilitator, and a very humble one, may I add. So guys, thank you so much, Gary. We'll be back. We'll talk to you soon.
Thanks for having me.